So today we're going to be breaking down a catchy plug-and-B or new jazz type melody inside of FL Studio. So for the first three sounds in the melody, they all stack together to make a really huge sounding chord progression. So the first one is from Serum, and it's the snow cone synth from the Stardust Serum Bank. And I went ahead and adjusted the first LFO and also added my own noise texture that I made on my pedals. For the next sound, it's the classic super chorus piano from Keyscape. And then finally the wing upright honky tonk piano. So here's what these sound like when they're all put together. So then here's the MIDI for the Serum synth and the Rhodes. So it's just a 3-chord progression that repeats for the entire time. When you're making these type of melodies, you really want to stick to 7th and 9th chords to get that smooth jazzy feeling. And overall, I have a couple go-to chord progressions that I like to use to start off these melodies. So I like to use a 3-2-5 progression, a 6-5-1 progression, or a 1-5 progression. So here's what the 3-2-5 sounds like. The 6-5-1. And then finally the 1-5. So those three options are all really solid to start off your melody. So for this one, I went with the 3-2-5. So we have this 7th on an F sharp, going into an F, and then finally an A sharp. And if you noticed, I actually have two notes that are not in the scale, so that's this A right here and this C right here. Those two notes do not appear at all in D sharp minor, but I was just messing around and they did work in the chords, so I left them in there. So then once I had those chords figured out, I went ahead and copied it over for the rest of the time. And the only variation I added was here at the end. I just brought back in that F chord and added in the bass notes of an A sharp chord. So then finally for the MIDI, I went ahead and worked on the bass notes. So I just went ahead and copied everything down an octave. And then the only special thing that I did was offsetting this F note and also bringing in the bass notes from the variation part, because these really stand out because I left a pause in the chord. So then here's the MIDI for the super chorus piano, and overall it's the exact same thing in the first half, but I went ahead and copied that over once more to make the pattern 16 bars long instead of 8. And then in the second half, what I did was just move the notes around to make an arpeggio, just to give it a little bit cooler of a sound. And overall I did this because I wanted to add shaper box on it, and I thought having an arp in shaper box would just make it sound a little bit more interesting than putting full chords through shaper box. Finally, for the MIDI for the honky tonk piano, it's very simple and it just copies the bass notes of the melody. The only variation that I left in here was having them double up sometimes. So as you can see, for the first hits, they are doubled up. This just makes it a little bit more full sometimes and a little bit more empty sometimes. But overall, this really just finishes off the chord stack and adds a lot of low end to it. So then finally for the effects on those, starting off with the synth, I added magic switch with the mix turned down to 75%, and then an EQ just to cut the lows. Moving on to the super chorus piano, I have that same magic switch and that same EQ. Then I went ahead and added the fruity phaser on the Aqua Nice preset, a pancake on the default preset with the LFO turned to 1/4, and then finally Shaper Box 3 on the high band grain preset. Finally for the honky tonk piano, again I have that same magic switch and the same EQ, and the only thing I added to this was Portal on the pitch artifacts preset with the mix turned down to 10%. So then moving on to the first lead of the melody, I have the old school silo synth from Omnisphere. So here's what that ends up sounding like. So then here's the MIDI for that, and as you can see, it's super simple and repetitive. For this melody, I really wasn't worried about adding too much variation because I wanted it to be really repetitive and catchy. So going back into the MIDI for this, as you can see, I just kind of copied some of the notes in the chords and just kind of hummed it in my head and placed notes till I thought it sounded right. The only variation in this entire pattern is moving this F up to an A sharp here in the second half, but otherwise from that, it's pretty much the same thing, just repeating over and over again. So then for the effects on that, I just have two EQs. So the first one is just a little one to boost the highs a bit, and then the second one is one just to cut all the lows. Moving on to the next sound in the melody, it's two one-shots that kind of combine together to make a cool lead pattern. So the first one is the soul lead from one of Sunboy's one-shot kits, and the second one is a key called Rona from one of XY's one-shot kits. So here's what those sound like when they're combined together. So then here's the MIDI for the soul lead, and overall again, it's super simple and repetitive. So I just went ahead and copied the notes from the chords. So this is the chord that we started off with, that F sharp, and then we went down to the note of the third chord, which was an A sharp. And I went ahead and timed this up to hit when that A sharp chord does. So it's just a nice little transition from the root note of the first chord to the root note of the third chord. And then for the second little slide, I did the exact same process, except if you remember, I had the F chord here going into an A sharp chord. So I just went ahead and copied that over. And how I make these one-shot slide is actually pretty simple. You just want to double click on the note that you want to slide, click this little triangle here, and then you have a slide note that'll slide in between each of the notes. So then here's the MIDI for that Brona key, and overall again, very, very simple. It's just 2 notes. So I just went ahead and put this A sharp note again because that is the root note of that third chord, and it is timed up to hit when that chord hits. So when that slide happens, then the chord hits, and then there's also this nice little accent sound just to make it a little bit more interesting. So then I only have 2 effects on that soul lead. So the first one is a D Blue crusher with the reduction at 5 samples and the smoothing at 100%, and then an EQ just to cut the lows and the highs. And then on the Rona key, I actually don't have any effects because I thought it sounded alright as it was. So then moving on to the final sound besides the basses, I went ahead into Serum and grabbed the rewind pluck, but I did edit the envelope and turn down the release a bit, and I went into the FX and turned off the reverb. So here's what that sounds like in the end. So then here's the MIDI for the rewind pluck, and overall just copies the notes and the chords going up and down the scale. My goal for this pattern was really just to add a little bit of sparkle and texture to the background of the loop, and overall I think I accomplished that. So then for the effects on that, this is probably the sound with the most effects. So we started off with Portal on the crystalline accent preset just to give off that sparkle, then Valhalla Supermassive on the default preset, next a D Blue crusher with the reduction at 5 samples and the smoothing turned to 100%, and then finally an EQ to boost the highs, and then one to cut all the lows. So then for the last 2 sounds of the melody, they're both basses that get combined together. So the first one is from Serum and it's called Classic But More, and the second one is of course a boo bass with the bass turned just a little bit up. So here's what those sound like together. So then here's the MIDI for that Serum bass, and overall it's super simple and just copies the bass notes. The only thing that I did differently was just leaving a lot of space and not copying all of the bass notes because I wanted to fill some of it in with that acoustic bass. And then here's the MIDI for the boo bass. So like I just mentioned, they kind of switch off. So where that other bass was, this one isn't. And then in the second half, the acoustic bass really fills it out. So again, they're kind of switching back and forth. So then for the effects on the boo bass and the Serum, I actually don't have any besides I switched the acoustic bass to mono, which is something I forgot to mention for the Chord Stack. So going back to the Chord Stack, I have the Serum set all the way to mono, the Rhodes halfway separated, and then the bass piano set all the way to mono. I did this just to kind of space the sounds out a little bit more. So the sounds that I want to drive the melody, I usually put those into mono. So that's the bass piano and the Serum, the sounds that kind of hit a little harder. And then for the sounds that are more spacey and I want to like fill up the melody, I'll set those onto separated and add an audio imager afterwards. So then the final thing I did for the melody was pitch it up one after it was all rendered together. So now the melody is in E minor instead of D sharp minor. So here's what everything sounds like all put together. Alright, so that's going to be pretty much it for the video. I hope you guys enjoyed. It's the 3rd attempt recording this video. So I had one phone storage full, I had one computer blue screen, and this time my mouse almost died, which would have been bad. But we made it through. It's looking good. I'm happy with the melody. But yeah, it's going to be pretty much it. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye!